Hello and welcome to Annotations to Art, Politics and Life Itself. My name is Nico Heller. My guest today is Keith McVeigh. Keith left school at 16. After spending 10 years in engineering, he enrolled as a mature undergraduate student at Queen's University Belfast, where in 1996 he was awarded a PhD in philosophy. In 2003, Keith returned part-time to Queen's for an MA in composition. He started performing in the late 1970s, during the heyday of the Belfast punk scene, and went on to play and record everything from folk, blues, and metal to serial, concrete, and experimental music. Keith and I go back a long way. We met in Belfast back in 1989, and over the next 3 years collaborated on a number of critically acclaimed projects, including a symphony on Luther, post-dramatic rendering of John Osborne's Luther, which at the time was the largest ever production staged at Belfast Civic Arts Theatre. We were connected last year when I was invited to co-create a silent lecture, our Belfast Lecture on Compassion, as part of my global silent lecture series. Now I can see that Keith is already here, so let me invite him in. There he is. Keith, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
We have sound.
Yes.
Those are the wonders of technology. Keith, I have already introduced you, and for those listeners who have been bearing with us, and apologies, we've had enormous trouble to get the sound going, and it's taken us at least 10 attempts, but here we are, we're live, and we're talking. Keith, I did already introduce you briefly, so let's kind of dig straight in. When we first started discussing the possibility of engaging in a dialogue about your work and practice, you sent me this statement from Hugo Ball, a quote, "Every word that is spoken and sung here at Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich represents at least this one thing, that this humiliating age has not succeeded in winning our respect." Now that was back in 1916, at the height of the First World War. From your perspective as a culture producer, Keith, as a philosopher, composer, pianist, what does Hugo Ball mean by this humiliating age?
Well, I can't speak very much about his politics, but I just think, and the story of Hugo Ball himself, he had just returned from, the front, where he tried to go and fight for his country, probably filled with romantic ideas, and he was so horrified at the horror that he found there, the mechanization of killing, that I think he got all his romanticism knocked out of him, and he realized that the situation was just completely absurd, and there was no point in paying any respect to that. And from what I've read from him and the other founders of Dadaism, their equation basically was anything that has led to this point of mindless destruction, we can't respect that anymore. So they would have included, all romantic art, and in fact, all art that had come before. So it was embracing the nonsense. I suppose you could tie it in with some sort of response to absurdity, and maybe in an Albert Camus sort of sense of embracing the absurdity. So their answers to every question was yes and no. And their new, I was going to call it a movement, but of course, Hugo Ball himself didn't like the idea of a movement. Again, the contradictory thing. For them, Dada was artistic anti-art. So the idea was we can't continue to engage in basically anything that's gone before this horror of the First World War, because it's such a nonsense. So in a way you can think of them as being destructive, but at the same time they had the spirit of creativity in them. So they wanted to go on being creative and being artistic, but in a way that was at the same time denying all the art that had gone before. And my connection with Hugo Ball is just a very personal kind of psychological thing. At a very young age, maybe the age of 16, I went to London by myself on pilgrimage just to look at some art, and I encountered Dadaism there. And I have no idea why, but it just really connected with me, and it's always stayed with me. He's just one of my heroes. And so rather than have any words of my own, I just borrowed his words when you asked me to talk about where we are in the world at the minute with art and whatever crises there might be at the minute. I just thought that was a pretty good quote and a pretty good attitude, and it sums up the nonsense that runs through most of my creativity. I just connect with that idea. And I'm not suggesting that we are living in horrendous times to that degree, but I also don't think we're living in very good times.
I mean, it's interesting, Keith. I mean, Hugo Ball, of course, was German, and he fled Germany, who was at war. And he fled Germany to avoid being drafted into the war. So he was actually, if you like, a refugee. He fled to Switzerland with his partner, and they opened this club, Voltaire, which was pretty much a nightclub, if you like. So it wasn't some kind of ivory tower. It was very much a kind of a place where people met. And I would imagine, you know, a lot of refugees too. I mean, people who'd been in similar situations, who had very existential, personal experiences, you know, with the war and with that situation. And within that context, this notion of humiliation is one that I think that's really worth reflecting on a little bit before we move on. I mean, what exactly was humiliating about this age for somebody like Hugo Ball, from your own imagination, when you kind of reflect on, you know, his journey from Munich to Zurich, leaving stuff behind, the risk of possibly being kind of captured and brought back by some kind of collaborators, Nazi collaborators, and of course also the poverty that went along with that, because of course they could only take very little things with them. So it was a very precarious, a very dangerous, a very unsettling time. And at the same time, these people were highly educated and cultured, sophisticated. So what exactly does Hugo Ball mean by humiliating times?
Well, one way, if I was to conjure up the feeling of humiliation, we could just think about our own time and watching the news and the sorts of people that are in charge of us and the sorts of people who are making decisions about our lives, particularly if you're not very well off, and looking at the very, very rich people that make decisions about how we, the not very rich, live our lives. That humiliation is the only word for that, really. You know, listen to people talking utter, nonsense, really, you know, and their ideologies and their self-preservation of their, I don't really want to talk about politics too much. I don't feel qualified, but it's just the powerful protecting their own and continuing to have what they have and wrapping it all up with ideologies which don't actually make any sense, don't follow through very well, ignoring the green issues, ignoring the state of the world and climate change. And I just think I get what Hugo Ball means when he says that.
It's interesting because, of course, he would have said that in German, in the German language.
Yes,
and
yes.
Humiliation in German is Erniedrigung. And Erniedrigung means lowering. It means you're being diminished. It's you could, instead of saying humiliating age, you could probably translate it as a diminishing age.
Okay.
And it's quite interesting. And of course, humiliation in English has a different sort of, if you like, sphere of resonance and Erniedrigung has in German. There's one aspect to Erniedrigung, and that is that when you fall to your knees, or when you're being asked to kneel, there is a kind of Erniedrigung, there's a kind of a humiliation when you're being asked to bow in front of whatever, somebody you don't respect, or this kind of idea. And it's very much in the German word, it's very much in the word. So there is, it's interesting, this idea of humiliation as a sort of a diminishing of who we are. It's not just kind of, in a way, hurting, or it's not just, but it's actually making us lesser humans. It's a sort of it's a very, very interesting thing, and the kind of the dehumanizing is very much, I think, part of that idea. Now, when you look at sort of Dadaist poetry or texts, they can feel very scrambled. They can feel very nonsensical. Why do you think, well, what is the link between that sort of scrambled, nonsensical aspect of Dadaism and the way that relates to the perception of reality?
Well, I kind of do. I don't know why. I haven't thought about this before, but I'm kind of relating it to it's the time of Freud and Jung and the beginnings of the existentialist thinking, I suppose. Well, it is really, the existentialists were up and running by then, and I know it's too early for Camus, but its response to the absurdity is to embrace it and to use humour. There's definitely humour there. And Eric Satie, who would be a hero of mine, favourite composer, he was among them as well. And it's impossible to write about that humour because it's almost performative. It does what it does. The poem does what it does when you listen to the nonsense of it, and it's beyond analysis, and that's kind of the point, because the analysis has got them nowhere. All the great thinking of the art critics and all the academies and so on lead us to trenches and a generation being killed in the mud. So why would you deal with that much sense ever again? Let's just babble nonsense. But it's also done in an artistic way, and that's kind of the genius of it, is that it is artistic anti-art. It's not just nihilism. It's not just let's burn the galleries or something like that. It's let's make another art. And I'm going to jump forward massively in our conversation to the sort of thing that you might find in an instant opera, just to mention that a bit early in our conversation. It might be instant and it might not be finished. And all those inherent contradictions that I think you do brilliantly give names to, the complete but not incomplete, complete but not complete. And all the time in the Dadaist manifestos, they will say that this is art and it is not art.
There's something interesting about the idea of the artist rejecting interpretation, isn't there? The artist rejecting the kind of the critical gaze. That is very interesting because, of course, that critical gaze, as you said very, correctly, very rightly so, in so many ways, this sort of Western rationality, our sort of sense of cultural superiority and sort of like our kind of sense making led us into this catastrophe that was the First World War, and of course the brutality of the trench warfare and the millions of people, the first industrial war in history, of course led to a certain sort of, you wouldn't say speechlessness, because of course there was speech, but a sort of a senselessness. And that is really, really well captured. But it is what makes Dadaism so interesting is that it is done in a very humane way. It is not kind of scrambled by a kind of automated computer program. It's not, it's very much the human mind scrambled by kind of historical events. It's a very, very interesting thing. Now, there are obviously kind of, like there have been other movements throughout history that in a way have engaged with, with their times. But actually, going back through the 20th century, not so many did. I mean, there have been many movements from, whatever, Cubism to this, that, and the other, which had their very own agenda, almost kind of, away from our social reality. Not quite. I mean, and a lot of people would kind of disagree with this, but they weren't kind of as existentially involved in our social reality the way Dadaism possibly was. Now, do you see anything comparable, anything comparable in today's kind of the cultural practice that would somehow engage? I mean, you've kind of touched on this. I mean, we've had climate, we've got the climate change crisis, we've got two wars going on, one in Israel, Palestine, one in the Ukraine. We have a kind of a cost of living crisis. We, levels of poverty and of child poverty unseen for decades in post-war Europe. And and there is a kind of a level of polarization in society, and a sort of a bigotry, and a sort of a level of hate in social media, and so on and so forth. That is quite extraordinary. So you would expect art in some ways to engage with this, not just at a kind of individual artist level, but you would imagine there to be some kind of collective response or some kind of movement emerge from that confronts that in the way Dadaism did. Can you see any kind of collective praxis that you feel kind of addresses, or kind of in an adequate way, or has the capability to address in an adequate way today's sort of challenges?
Well, if you mean by contemporary, you know, I mean now, this bubble of time right now, sort of 5-year period, I'm coming up blank. I'm not thinking of anything. But if you let the word contemporary a bit bigger, you might say, and this is quite interesting for you and I to talk about this, punk rock in a way. I'm not a huge fan of punk rock, you know, artistically speaking or musically speaking, but you have to say it is an interesting phenomenon, you know, and particularly the punk rock where I come from, in Northern Ireland, was of a different shade to elsewhere. It was a bit less nihilistic. There was more hope in it, and there was a better. It was more of a cultural response. So it was taking things back to ground zero in a way. It was like year zero. We're doing music again. We're doing it with 3 chords, and we're not doing it with very much ability. And we're taking it back. And funny enough, another phrase just comes into my mind just as I'm saying that. The subtitle of Hugo Ball's earlier book is called The Dandyism of the Poor, which is a very interesting phrase. Dandyism or bohemianism is kind of referred for, you imagine, well-off people who maybe choose to live poorly. But what about people who are just actually poor? Are they allowed to be that? Are they allowed to be ridiculous and humorous and artistic? Well, yeah. So the reason why I said a bit of interesting for you and I to talk about this, so we talk about punk rock in Belfast. To those outside Belfast, you know, in England or something, they might not get the nuance of Northern Irish punk rock because it was actually a bit more like the ideology of the hippies. There was a bit more about peace and love because the place where they were was in a violent part of the world, with the troubles, the Northern Irish troubles going on, and their response was to, well, if you paint it in a very good light, you might say they were less sectarian than any of the politicians or any of the people in power or anybody teaching them in school or anybody in their churches. The punks actually were the antithesis of that violence, even though they have like an image of punky violence. There's a lot more to be said about that. But my main answer to your question is not right now, because that is going back a bit, obviously. And then I was also thinking of going back a few years before that, you have Kraut rock, which, as I understand it, was German young people trying to get a new musical form because they were still living in a post-war time, and if they lived in a rural community or something, they still had people who had you'll tell me about this, were not very good histories from the wartime. There were people who were the Lord Mayor of their little town who was a Nazi, and they had to reject it and they had to move on. But they also did not want to just sound like Americans, and they didn't want to sound like British pop either. So they used synthesizers and they didn't use guitars. And you have this thing called Kraut rock, which I always thought was very funny that they were happy enough with that term, but they were. And that was quite revolutionary. It's definitely a response, and it's definitely a bit of nonsense in there. There's a lot of humor in Kraut rock, definitely. And there's a lot of humor in punk as well, and nonsense. And, I would sort of think of my answer to the question was no, contemporary. Right now, I can't think of an example of what you're asking for. Somebody actually responding in any way like the Dadists were responding to their humiliating time. But if you go back a wee bit, I would mention punk, particularly Northern Irish punk, and Kraut rock, as I understand it.
It's interesting because, of course, in music, especially in the kind of the wider field of popular music, and I kind of would include rock in that, there you have kind of cultural currents which, in a way, were driving change. It actually started, of course, long before punk. rock and roll, kind of like, and kind of what preceded it, really up from the 1950s onwards, electronic music, and then obviously, with rock and roll and all the rest, and then of course going into things like punk later, kind of paved the way, and in a way you could almost sort of see as punk as a sort of a rejection of the kind of the bourgeois values of rock and roll, the kind of a sort of a rejection of the Mick Jaggers of this world. Yeah. I mean, or the Lord Jaggers, I should say, and that, yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. They became they became appropriated. They became part of the kind of the mainstream in the way, and that almost didn't kill, but it somehow took away some of the magic, of the music, and of course punk kind of recaptured that, and you're absolutely right, and that probably was the last time that happened. Of course, there's another kind of movement, and I never really kind of engaged with that to any significance, but of course, the techno had also a similar, very different, but a kind of a thing of sort of a liberating thing, because it was these massive underground parties. It was, it was a bit like pirate radio. It was this idea of doing things outside the mainstream without licenses to, and again, there was a kind of drive and a kind of thing about that. And techno had, of course, very different forms in different countries. So the German techno quite different, say, from French techno or British techno. And so again, there was everything like that. And of course, another thing, which again is quite not alien, but not really my kind of thing, the whole hip hop thing, and the gangster rap and all that. Again, these were kind of cultural musical expressions that in some ways responded to the kind of the social reality. But now looking at today and currently, I don't see any of this anymore. I mean, you have the old guys who basically kind of bring their bands back together to kind of fund their retirement, but that's about it. In fact, the likes of the Beatles, you mustn't forget the Beatles started, of course, I believe in Liverpool. They went to art college, and then they went on the dole. They kind of claimed benefits for years or for a long time before they actually started to make money with their music. Now, in today's system, with like horrendous college fees and very, very kind of like minimal kind of benefits, it's very hard for any band or any musician to come up now, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't know if you're agreeing with me then, or is it possible we're missing the point that how many people at the time of Cabaret Voltaire knew that was going on? Is it possible? It's not really possible, actually. So my answer to your question is no. I can't see the artistic response to our current humiliating times, and it seems to me that you're saying the same thing, that you can't think of anything right now. And I was going to ask you the question then, is it possible we're just missing the point? We're just looking in the wrong place and we're not seeing it? But to answer my own question, with social media and all, surely we should be hearing about it, How could it be that there is a good response somewhere, that there is something like punk going on, or something like, a response from the disenfranchised in rejection to the establishment, and we're missing it? I don't think we're missing it. I can't see it unless I'm wrong. I can't see it. So
I think there's a couple of kind of sort of like sort of challenges or problems or coming together here. One is, of course, that when you look at Dadaism, or the Dadaist kind of movement and how they expressed themselves, it was a very immediate way of expressing. They didn't kind of go through the kind of rigmarole of kind of like, writing a funding application and waiting for Arts Council funding or somebody to kind of give them money and then print some posters or kind of set up some social media kind of operation or whatever. No, they just basically did it. Yeah. And so it was a very immediate, a very raw, a very direct way of responding, and there was very little filtering going on. And so that direct, unfiltered response enabled them also to do whatever they wanted and to be whoever they wanted to be. Yeah. So I think, the kind of the Dadaism of the day would not be possible now when people think in these funding terms. because it just somehow makes it look really silly to kind of go through a real fundraising drive to then put on a show, people wrapped in cardboard and kind of coming up with scrambled words. Why do you have to kind of go for a big fundraising thing for that? Well, yeah, we all have to live. I accept that. But the two things don't necessarily have to, be synonymous. And so in a way, I think there is this issue that we have started to professionalize the arts in a way, or we have not just started, but we have actually professionalized and commodified the arts in a way that this kind of immediacy is kind of now very, very hard to achieve. Because of course the other thing is funding cycles operate on time scales of 12 to 18 to 24 months. So you're now kind of thinking about what you're going to do next year or the year after, which again, is great, but it puts you into this kind of planning, into this sort of strategic frame of mind, which is very, very different. And of course, you don't want to mess up your funding relationships either. So you got to somehow, make sure that if it's critical in the kind of the right way. Because of course, a certain form of critique is very welcome, but other forms of critique are not. And so you're going to make sure that that you're on the right side of critique as well as anything. And that kind of makes for kind of quite a staged, managed kind of culture. Now, let me, this is a thing. I mean, there've been a number of movements. Dada, as you mentioned, but one that also really inspired me great is Fluxus. The Fluxus movement, of course, there was big names like Joseph Beuys and others associated with this. But the guy who actually came up with it, he's almost been forgotten again. He was a kind of a today he would be seen as a kind of almost marginal figure. And it's interesting, the kind of influence Fluxus had. It started as a publication, interestingly enough. But it kind of went far beyond that. And then another kind of movement that I also thought was really interesting, Art Povere, this kind of Italian movement that sort of had this idea that we need to, in some ways, for as long as we create art that requires significant resources to do it, we have to somehow secure those resources before we can do it. So Art Povere was all about kind of doing away with that, peeling away those requirements, working with found objects, with things they found the street, kind of, and rearranging things and working in a very improvised, sort of ephemeral kind of way. And again, that kind of, and this was back in the 1960s, 70s, was taking them back very much to kind of a Dadaist kind of frame of reference. So I thought that was really, really interesting. Now, of course, I've been working on my own sort of, if you like, sort of critique of contemporary cultural practice, and kind of, I wouldn't mind sort of reading out briefly this kind of manifesto that I sort of come up with, because I think it really relates directly. If you like, I wouldn't say it's a 21st century version of Dada, because it's not. I mean, history doesn't repeat itself that way, but it is in some ways responding or looking for ways that would open up spaces where we can have a direct engagement with the kind of issues of our day without having to go through these filters and having to constantly ask for permission. So let me just read this out. Towards a shared understanding of a new form. So, some notable exceptions notwithstanding, no art form is as overtly elitist and as inherently imperialist as opera. At the same time, through the combination of sound or music, art or drama, performance or acting, and movement or dance, opera offers artists of all stripes and colors a shared canvas that is potentially larger, and a collaborative platform that is potentially richer and more diverse than any other. As our fundamental freedoms and human rights increasingly come under serious and sustained attack, our democracies are on the retreat, and authoritarianism is on the rise again globally. Opera must reinvent itself, free itself from its imperialist traditions, so that we can realize its full potential as a contemporary cultural force for good. For this to happen, we need to start thinking and practicing opera differently. We need to do away with entrenched social and cultural conventions, with big budgets, large stage sets, and long rehearsal periods. In other words, we need to free opera from the constraints artists have no control over and reconstitute it as a popular practice. We call this new practice instant opera. It puts the means of cultural production where they belong, namely at the artist's disposal. Whilst instant opera comes with its own set of constraints, it allows artists to create autonomously works of great beauty that only ever exist in the here and now, works that are always provisional yet final, that are partial but yet incomplete, that come into being instantaneously whenever we come together as equals to practice our art collaboratively. As a self-governing, interdisciplinary practice, instant opera is neither intrinsically nor exclusively linked to any particular type of institution or target demographic. Instead, it occupies underutilized and overlooked spaces to reach new audiences. Instant opera is a relational practice where performers negotiate their relationship to the work, to each other, and to their audience during performance each time anew, and in so doing co-create unique temporary works of living art. Instant opera differs from other live art performance practices in that it implies a shared approach, text, and/or score, and often involves a director, a writer, a composer, and/or conductor. Whilst rehearsals are kept to an absolute minimum, a few hours at most, instant opera requires participants to practice their parts independently beforehand, learn the lines, etc., so that everyone enters each collaboration fully prepared. Given its impromptu nature, not all scores and texts or scripts lend themselves to be presented as instant opera, and hence many need to be adapted, if not rewritten entirely. Over time, this will create a new genre with its very own repertoire of works. Part gig, part happening, instant opera has the potential to decolonize opera by limiting unwanted outside influences whilst unbounding collective creativity, to democratize opera by opening new spaces and reaching new audiences, and to transform opera by shortening production cycles and facilitating risk-taking. The opera is dead. Long live the opera. So that's, the idea that we have created these institutions, the institution of the theater, the institution of the opera house and the opera, the institution of the concert hall, the institution of the art gallery. And we have created production lines that deliver, that kind of feed, cultural product, into these spaces. And we are doing this in a really clever way, in a way so that we still feel that this is all very open, very democratic, and very free. But the reality is a very, very different one. It's become a professionalized, sort of scientificated. There was a time, my old professor in Belfast in fine art, Alistair McLennan, I believe he doesn't have a master's degree. Didn't exist back then when he was at college. Well, a few years later, the master's degree was brought in and you had to have a master's.
Yep.
That only lasted a few years because now you need to have a PhD. And this kind of inflation that has started in the arts is really quite extraordinary. And it goes hand in hand with the sort of the commodification, professionalization of the arts outside the academy. And so the question is, how can sort of a Dadaism or a Fluxus or an art pauvre kind of re-emerge as a mirror and as a sort of a cultural response to the kind of the challenges we face?
Mm-hmm. I was having a smile to myself when you were talking about the cycle of getting funding being anything as long as 24 months. And I was thinking, Dada would have come and gone in that period. If the Dada had sought funding in 2017 or in 1917, by the time they got their funding, it would have been disbanded.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
not only that,
yep.
It was such a fragile and such a difficult period. Do you really think the Swiss government
Yes.
or a Swiss authority would have given,
Yeah.
Hugo Ball money to stand there and in kind of like the way he did and to do his thing. No way.
And to relate it also to my own kind of history, and here I'm talking about just youth as much as anything else. Uh, in 1979 or something like that, I probably would have been in 3 different bands in 1 year. We'd have got together, we could have rehearsed some songs, done a gig. Next band, that's done. Move on. The idea of having to get funding to do that type of thing, or I don't know, be involved in some big organization to make it happen. So again, that's where punk comes into it as well. It's about not having a big, massive record company behind you. Just invent a record company now. Do it now. Give it a name. Do it. Get your own record pressed. Put them out. Take them down to the record shops yourself. Hand them over yourself. No manager. No company. No record company. No music company. That's a small picture of the same thing, So yeah, we need something like that again. We do. I agree with everything in your manifesto. I think it's very, very well written. I think it's very inspiring. And I haven't thought about this before. I was trying to think about something that I do without really trying to plan it out like that. Is my performance has been very limited recently. My playing the piano, obviously because of COVID. But if you go back to just the year just before COVID, I did do things spontaneously. I would play the piano with my bass player, Richard Chabley, in Starbucks. I played a gig in Starbucks every week for coffee. I was paid with coffee. But I did not owe anybody anything. I did not have to play any particular type of music. Do you know what I mean? So I only played my own music, and it was quite experimental at times. And I had my own rules about what constituted an artistic success. So in my book, all the concerts were successful because I didn't care. It wasn't about people clapping. It wasn't about the people that owned the cafe saying, thank you for increasing our products, increasing our profits that night. I didn't owe them anything. They weren't paying me. So without really meaning to. Well, because of the humiliation of the times, because of it being so hard to get a gig, so hard to get a venue, I just did what I could, which is a gig in Starbucks. It worked okay. So I love the idea of doing that with other people, all with the same mindset. Let's do this. Just let's do it.
It's interesting, when you think about it. I mean, prior to the 20th century, in fact, presumably really kind of almost leading up to the to the early mid 1950s, sort of art culture was a sort of a kind of a middle class or an upper class pursuit. I mean, the kind of the Mozarts, the Beethovens, of this world, they would be living at the courts. They would be performing, for like a kind of an aristocratic or kind of extremely well-heeled audience, whilst peasants had their folk culture, which was very, very different. But that distinction between folk culture and high culture was a kind of a class distinction as much as anything. And then, of course, like in the 20th century, in the 1920s, with the kind of the Bauhaus and the kind of emergence of art colleges and also the kind of mass education that kind of then kind of really kind of blossomed after the Second World War. And alongside with that, the welfare state that kind of provided some basic sort of security for people to make choices about their lives that they wouldn't make if they didn't have that basic security. So there was a kind of, on the one hand, the educational system broadened out and opened up and kind of expanded, and on the other hand, of course, the welfare provisions, the welfare state expanded so that people felt they could actually sort of take advantage of that. So in the post-war years, all of a sudden, kind of a culture emerged that was neither the kind of the high culture of the upper classes of the kind of 18th, 19th century, nor was it the folk culture of the peasants of that time. It was a kind of a democratization of culture, which was really quite extraordinary. And so much of what we think of in terms of modernism, in terms of modern art and modern music, and of course then also popular music and rock, punk, all of these things they in a way were generated. They came through this kind of democratization of culture, and blossomed in that. That was really, if you like, it was a high period of culture that was as much shaped bottom up as it was kind of orchestrated top down. It was a very, very interesting period, sort of 1950 right up to 1980, maybe sort of like mid 80s, late 80s. It's at that point it sort of started to crumble. But now we have ended sort of into a very different age, and we still have these kind of points of reference of this post-war period where we kind of make those comparisons. But of course, the social and the kind of economic reality for young people today is so fundamentally different from what it was in the 1970s. That of course they don't have those choices anymore. I mean, if you want to kind of bring out, like, if establish yourself as a band, how are you going to pay for that promotional video? You know, how are you going to get up on the rankings of Spotify or iTunes or whatever? You need significant investment behind you to do that. And of course, who's going to get that investment? And the same, of course, goes for artists. How are you going to get your first catalog? How are you going to get your first couple of exhibitions to make your name? Of course, that all needs to be funded, and these days, increasingly is funded privately. Through families and friends of those artists. We're moving back into kind of sort of a class system, and the question is, and that clearly doesn't, in so many ways, doesn't kind of provide sufficient dexterity for it is a very much it's entertainment. It's decoration, it's product, and so the question is what kind of cultural strategies can we develop as musicians? What can a band do now to kind of to get their stuff out there?
Yeah, no, I have no idea. An instant opera would be the answer. Really? I have no idea. I'm in quite a pessimistic state around the whole thing. I've been brought low in that sense of humiliated. So the only thing I come up with, just without really planning too much, is just do things on a small scale, immediate. Like,
this is the thing. So there's a kind of almost a catalog of boxes we can tick. Because anything that in a way that creates a hurdle, that requires funding, that requires a permission, that requires a say-so of someone else, is essentially going to stop you from doing it. And if it's only one permission you need to get, then that's and if you can just go and ask, then that's an easy thing. But if you need multiple permissions stretched out for one thing, for one production or for one idea, stretched out over 18 months, by the time you get to the end of this and you ask for your last permission and you then get turned down at that last point, and we've all had that experience, then you basically spent 18 months on an idea, on a project, on a work of art, on a musical score, whatever it might be, that'll never see the day of light, the light of day. So this is a thing, isn't it? It's kind of finding a way of doing things on the cheap, using spaces outside established spaces. And of course, doing that will shape the art we make. Like during Prohibition, jazz in the US was very quiet, wasn't it? Because we had to be quiet because you wanted to have a drink and it had to be quiet, and so you couldn't play loud music. So the music during Prohibition was very much reflected the spaces and the kind of the conditions, within which it was performed. The same, of course, goes with so many other kind of art forms. It's the kind of the conditions that determine the art, to a large extent. And of course, Dadaism is no exception there. Dadaism in a way was a direct response, a direct reflection of the sort of the monstrous, nonsensical kind of idea of war. And Fluxus, of course, again, and so you had these movements. And what we have to do now, I think, as artists, as musicians, as dancers, as performers, as painters, we need to find ways of practicing and building an audience that doesn't involve asking for permission. And that is that's the crux of it. And that'll create a new aesthetic, because the kind of the permissions systems have evolved, and so making art that kind of squeezes through and gets past the permission system today will look very different from what it would have looked like in the 1950s or in the 1920s. Yeah. So I think that's a kind of a really kind of interesting, really interesting thought. Going back once more to your own practice I found it quite interesting the way you have been kind of going between. I mean, you started off really, as a I wouldn't say as a school dropout, but you left school early, and then you basically went into kind of in a typical kind of working class kind of factory environment, and spent 10 years essentially in a blue collar kind of environment. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a eureka moment when you decided, I can be a doctor, I can be a philosopher.
Well, yes, that's right.
You want to tell me a little bit, because I think that history, that kind of sense, I think this is the kind of the eureka moments that I think that people need to rediscover in their own lives now.
Sure, yeah, but I just have to say one thing to you. I have a student about to arrive at 1:15, so we'll have to keep it really quick.
Let's wrap it up. Yes.
Yeah, I did have a moment where I just realized, I think the time before I met you actually, but you would have been part of this as well. Just to cut a long story short, you more or less said something to me. If you're going to be a composer, be a composer. It's not a hobby. And but even before that, yes, I just decided I didn't need to work in a factory anymore. I needed to do what then I was passionate about, which was philosophy. So I did. I just made a decision, and that was with very, very little education. I just got into university by the side door, by getting to know lecturers and talking to them and convincing them that I could do it. And I didn't go to university to get a degree. I went to get a PhD. I wanted to go as far as I could and read as much as I could. So yes, that was like one of the few big decisions I made in life. And then that's merged later on by deciding, if I'm going to write music, I need to know more about it. So I'll go and do a master's in composition. Yeah, just for myself, not to get qualifications, just to be in the right place. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Keith, thank you very, very much. I mean, I think there's something about this sort of long biographies of, like yours, but I mean, actually mine is also quite a long-winded biography, but that's a story for another day. But, where you, in a way, follow, it sounds like terribly cliched. I wouldn't say a dream, but a sort of you basically, where you think about your life, not in terms of kind of a sort of a series of career progressions, but where you think about your own life, essentially also, if you like, as a work of art, as something that you shape and that you hopefully at some point in your life later on are able to look back at and say, well, I have done all right. Not in terms of making money, but the kind of human being I have become. And I think going back to Hugo Ball,
yes,
this idea of a humiliating age.
Yes,
it's in those times, I think, where it is particularly difficult to stay the course.
It is.
It is in those times when we are being diminished, when we kind of find ourselves making compromises that we wouldn't make at other times, where we kind of come up against our own limitations, our own weaknesses, our own fears. And I think we are, in that sense, in a humiliating age, in a way that it makes it very, very difficult to be that artist, to be that philosopher without the kind of institutional trappings that kind of give you the security. And so I think at this very personal level, anybody who really has a sense of who or what they want to be and see how our times hold us back, will understand this notion of a humiliating age very intuitively. And I can see that you're kind of really waiting to finish, because there's somebody in the background who wants to be taught, presumably piano or the guitar.
You have to make money as well.
Oh God, that's terrible. We all do. I know. So Keith, I thank you very, very much. It's been a slow start, very difficult to get us together.
I made it short. Sorry.
But nonetheless, it's been a really, really nice talk, and I hope we'll kind of carry that on at some point in the future.
That would be good. Great. Thanks, Nico. Thank you. I'll see you again.
Absolutely. See you soon. Cheers. Bye.